Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We'll start the press conference of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation. The interpretation will be and is provided. Russian English is available. So I give the floor to Mr. Lavrov.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your interest in the work of our delegation. I'm confident that you are familiar with those statements which we delivered at the Security Council on Wednesday and at the General Assembly that was just delivered. Our objective was to convey as clearly as possible the vision of our country vis-a-vis the developments in international relations, vis-a-vis our understanding of what needs to be done in order to ensure that the problems that have accumulated in an unprecedented way in these relations, for these problems to somehow be resolved, first and foremost by seeking mutual consent through mutual respect of all states, barring none. This is a policy which is increasingly supported by countries in the global south. However, it is faced with resistance from countries of the collective West, as we now say, the global minority who in both politics and the economy and in information, the information space and culture, even in sport, using dirty tricks, they're trying to maintain their domination or to expand their hegemonic position. For this reason, in contacts with our colleagues, Asian, African, Latin American countries, we discussed in detail and described in detail in response to their questions. We described the concrete aspects of the current stage in the European security crisis. This broke out as a result of the West transforming Ukraine over many long years into an anti-Russia, preparations for it being dragged into NATO and encouragement of the regime in Kiev, which came to power as a result of a key and the generation of direct threats to the Russian Federation and our borders, as well as the annihilation of everything Russian in Ukraine, in its laws, in its educational system, in terms of mass information, media, and culture, and so on and so forth. So this is a crisis in European security. This is an ongoing crisis. We hope that certain conclusions will be drawn by those politicians who generally analyze and recognize the fact that they will do so. There aren't many of them, but there probably still are some left. And we also see how the countries of the global south, of the global majority, how strong their position is, first and foremost when it comes to upholding their national interests. And from that standpoint, they don't wish to join the anti-Russian sanctions, and they don't wish to participate in any campaigns organized by the West when people are pushed into participating in certain events to compel them to speak out in favor of Ukraine, to condemn Russia, and to accuse it of all sins. We also proceed from the premise of our national interests. So everybody who operates in this way, they are prospective partners for the Russian Federation. There were more than 30 meetings with colleagues, and we discussed with them prospects for bilateral relations where there are many new, interesting, and promising projects which we stand ready together with our friends to implement on the basis of mutual benefit. And of course, we will continue to develop cooperation through BRICS. There was a separate meeting held of the ministers at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There was a ministerial meeting on the sidelines of the General Assembly of the SCO. There was a meeting of the CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, on cooperation and trust building in Asia. And of course, we trust that all of these regional associations will proactively buttress the processes of reform of the United Nations, making this more sustained and legitimate in nature. And this includes as part of the ongoing discussions on Security Council reform. which we support. I don't wish to continue to speak in this way. I'd rather respond to your questions now.
Goes to UN Correspondent Association President Valeria Rebecca, please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association for this press conference. It's Valeria Rebecca from ANSA Newswire. So my question is, if Ukrainian President Zelenskyy withdraws the decree prohibiting negotiations, would Russia sit at the negotiating table with or without conditions? It would be only you and Ukraine, or do you want UN to lead the process? Do you think the presidential election in Russia could be an obstacle to a possible peace negotiation before March? And lastly, Ukraine has announced a peace summit with every nation that is against Russian aggression. How do you evaluate this proposal? Thank you so much.
It's very easy for me to respond to this question because this is comprised of presumptions and subjunctives. And this all begins with what will happen if Zelenskyy cancels his decree. We are guided not by certain fantasies. First of all, he hasn't yet rescinded this, and nobody intends to he's going throughout the world asking for money, asking for attention, asking for weapons, asking for other things. So this is not part of our rules. Once again, what we are guided by is the naked truth, and it is as follows. Zelenskyy and everybody who is governing him in Brussels, London, in one word, firmly say there is no other basis for peace other than the Zelenskyy format. No other basis for this exists. And the Zelenskyy blueprint it can be described in different ways, but it is completely not feasible. It is not possible to implement this. It's not realistic, and everybody understands this. But at the same time, they say this is the only basis for negotiations. And in general, there's a need to vanquish the Russian Federation on the battlefield. And that's what we hear as facts. So we draw our conclusions that nobody wants to seriously show an understanding of what is happening, including those who understand, don't wish to do so publicly. And under these circumstances, then if they say on the battlefield, fine, it will be on the battlefield. It's fine. Yes, during his statement, Antonio Guterres announced that Russia allegedly is abducting children from Ukrainian soil. After his statement, have you had an opportunity to speak with him? And was it possible to clarify from him what he meant and what facts he is basing himself on saying this? And on the whole, what is your assessment of the bias of an individual who leads up an international organization which Russia was a founding member of? I think that many were surprised by the statement from the Secretary General at the Security Council meeting, during which he suddenly and unexpectedly, in addition to other unfounded allegations about what is happening in Ukraine, suddenly decided to deliver a broad passage about children who had gone missing, abducted, who are being concealed, those who are subject to hunger and famine, and so on and so forth. It was surprising for me to hear this, especially about children, because the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children in Armed Conflict, Madam Virginia Gamba, visited us not so long ago. She spent some days engaged in detailed discussions. There were meetings held in shedding light on questions that were of concern to her, and all of the responses were provided, including when she was meeting with Maria Lvova-Belova, our ombudsman on the rights of the child, with whom we are working very closely. And when we heard that Mr. Guterres, what he said at the Security Council, then during a meeting with him the following day, among other issues, I asked about on the basis of what facts he makes such allegations, because there were no references made. And the response has not yet been forthcoming, but I did ask him to provide a response to me to that question, because this is a serious matter. And by the way, it so happened that each year there are new issues and new questions that are unaddressed that arise in our relationship with the Secretary General. Last year at the Security Council, there was a discussion of the latest dimension of the Ukrainian issue, and what was voiced was an accusation against Russia in connection with the tragedy in the city of Bucha. And a half a year passed at the time, and because of that, I said in the microphone, we have been unsuccessfully trying to get to the bottom of what happened there. And to begin, we wish to have a list of the last names of those people whose bodies were shown in pictures throughout the world, and they became the reason for the latest outburst of hatred and sanctions lists and so on. And nobody was able to provide us with this response. And we turned to various structures. That's why I turned to the distinguished Antonio Guterres in the presence of all members of the Security Council, other members of the United Nations, in the microphone to leverage his authority to do something that seemed to be quite simple, just to receive a list of the last names of those people whose bodies were depicted in Bucha. And we have not yet received that, nor have we received an explanations yet about a number of other questions. Questions beginning with the poisoning of the Skripals. There have been no documents provided. The poisoning of Navalny, the same in Germany. We are told we won't let you see the analysis in the OPCW. We have this, but Germany is prohibiting us from doing this. Why? That's an interesting question. And how about there be some journalistic investigations into the events a little bit more recent than the Kennedy murder, which they were unable to fully shed light on, but at least those events that the West was used in order to create a certain atmosphere in international discussions, and using these fakes to try to use them to advance certain decisions that have nothing to do with reality or the prospects. By the way, the Malaysian Boeing, which was downed in July of 2014, the question is very simple, and we have not been able to have a response to this. Why is it that when the investigation began to be conducted, Russia provided satellite data, radar data was provided by Russia, and the Ukrainians did not provide data? They said that the radar wasn't working. Then the Americans said we have satellite data, and this data corroborates that this was done by the Russians. But we're not going to share this data with anyone. And the court in the Netherlands is considering the question when we still have a confirmation from the United States about satellite data. And as for the questions of our lawyers, where are they? The data is confidential. We were not provided us with this data, but we have no reason, they say, not to believe the United States. And in addition to all of this, 12 of the 13 witnesses on the side of the accusation remained anonymous. They were not shown to anybody. It's not Bucha. I hope they're all alive. Not just there are no last names for Bucha about who is depicted, but also the witnesses for the Malaysian Boeing. Their names have also not been provided. So, of course, turning back to the question about children, we are, of course, waiting for the Secretary General to substantiate the statements which he makes, because he needs to speak on behalf of the United Nations Secretariat, as is set out in the charter, the main administrative official. And that's the capacity in which he needs to operate, not allowing departure from Article 100 of the United Nations Charter, which states that all Secretariat staff headed by the Secretary General need to be impartial, work impartially in a neutral way, without receiving instructions from any government whatsoever. So we're waiting for responses.
Very much, Maria. Thank you, Mr. Minister. It's Pamela Falk from CBS News, you know, from here at UN headquarters. My question is about the Ukrainian children. You mentioned them. The numbers that Ukraine, the ICC, and other prosecutors have is about 19,000 children taken from Ukraine. A few hundred have been returned. I can show you videos. There are specific examples of an interview we did with some children who escaped. What is the plan? When will Russia cooperate with Virginia Gamba or the UN, or begin to return these children in any more expedited way? Thank you.
I just said that Virginia Gamba spent several days with us, and we continue to be in contact with her. I've seen various videos that you refer to, and we all know how those videos are made. They also showed a video about Bucha and bodies lying in the streets, and what now? We have repeatedly seen information disseminated about what is really happening with the children. And I will ask for our mission to share materials with you that we have repeatedly disseminated, including in the UN, and explaining that all the children that ended up in Russia unaccompanied by guardians, that list is openly available, unless the list of names of the bodies in Bucha. We have a list of the children who are alive, as well as ways to contact those who can then help these children become reunited with their families if those families are found. This is something that we have explained repeatedly, but we will, of course, share those materials with you.
About Bucha, I'm talking about these children, and there are lists. Is it possible to...
Yes, as I said just now, and perhaps you weren't listening, unlike Bucha, where no one has given us those names, we have the names of these children who are alive, thank God, and we have given those names to everyone a long time ago. And if those families are found, we will assist reunification with those children. The vast majority of these children are children who were living in orphanages, whose parents had sent them to these orphanages for various reasons. And when the special military operation began, of course, we took them to safety. But we never tried to conceal the names of these children, which we took out of the country, and we never concealed their location. And we have always invited and continue to invite parents, if these parents are out there, to come and collect their children. You can come and travel to these children yourself. I just want to add that on October 16th, we have a press conference planned by Maria Lvov-Belova, who's the Ombudsman for Children, and we invite you personally to take part in that press conference and ask every question that you like. And if you share your materials in advance, she will be happy to comment on them. And now, Al Jazeera Arabic.
Arabic. In your speech, you mentioned that it's time to restore mutual trust between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Yet what we've seen this week was some blame game with Armenia. There were some anti-Russia protests in Yerevan. Has Russia lost or is Russian influence in that region waning or declining given its preoccupation with the war in Ukraine?
It is not up to me to judge. It would be very arrogant to say that our influence is increasing in the region. It remains the same. It's up to you to decide. Many things are becoming clear right in front of our eyes right now. What is happening in Armenia and a number of other former Soviet member states is that there is a very powerful lobby, including through NGOs backed by Western states and are advancing the interests of the U.S. and their allies. And these interests include undermining Russia's influence. This is a fact. There is a great number of such organizations there. And when there was previous unrest and Mr. Pashinyan spoke out against the former government and demanded justice, we saw all this. We see this as artificially created tensions. We once again know who is interested in this and who is pulling the strings. And unfortunately, the leadership of Armenia from time to time adds fuel to the fire itself. For example, after Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Aliyev, under the auspices of the EU, signed a document recognizing the territorial integrity of each other's states within 1991 borders, meant that Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Azerbaijan, pure and simple. And after that, when they signed a document under the auspices of the EU, they forgot to add that, of course, the rights of the residents of Karabakh as a national minority must be ensured. They forgot to include that. And when discussions began in Armenian society, and this happened again recently, discussions about how things really happened and who gave Nagorno-Karabakh to who, the head of the parliament of Armenia said that Karabakh was given to Azerbaijan by Putin in 2020 when we signed agreements on signing the 44-day war, on ending, rather, that war. Those agreements, if you're interested, said that Nagorno-Karabakh is within the area of responsibility of the Russian peacekeeping contingent, and it was presumed, this was discussed during negotiations, that the decision on the status of Nagorno-Karabakh would be postponed and would be taken later. So after the Prime Minister of Armenia signed a document acknowledging Nagorno-Karabakh as part of Azerbaijan, it is ludicrous to accuse us of this. Oh, there's a great number of similar politicians with a similar background there, but we are convinced that the Armenian people remember their history, our history, and that they will tie their history to that of Russia and other friendly states in the region rather than those who swoop in from abroad.
RT International. Okay. So, yes, please, yes.
For CNN. I wonder if you could explain just what is the purpose or value for you of continuing to come to UNGA, for Russia even to continue participating in the UN, given the reported isolation that you've experienced here, the criticisms of structures within the UN and the world order it represents, and even obviously Russia's violation of this central principle of non-violation of territorial sovereignty. Could you just explain your perspective?
CNN's questions have become even easier since our last meeting. I work here because there are things to do here. If you want to describe our isolation, you can feel free. You see our delegation meeting with others here, participating in various multilateral events. We are working with those who respect themselves and who will never betray their national interests because someone from Washington has told them to. We know how American diplomats travel around the world and prohibit meetings with our diplomats and with representatives of Russia in general. I'll say the following. The U.S. is a superpower. That's clear to everyone. But to run around like this, threatening everyone, only then to show one's obsession with domineering, well, it's simply embarrassing for a great nation to act this way, whereas we are working with those who are prepared to work with us. I don't have a second to be bored here. I've been working yesterday. I worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., for example.
Hi, Minister. This is De Zhishu with China Central Television. Questions on Black Sea Initiative. Your Western colleagues accusing Russia of using food as weapons by not extending the Black Sea Initiative. What's your response? Have you ever talked to the Secretary General on this issue? And may I ask one more question? The Nord Stream pipeline, it's been almost 1 year since the explosion. Comparing to the Black Sea Initiative, we have a very silent global audience, while the UN is quite shy from even expressing concern on this issue. Do you have any new findings? Thank you.
The Black Sea Initiative
consisted of two parts. It was a package that was born from negotiations and which reflected the interests, all the interests of the parties, together with the interests of other participants. But while the Ukrainian part of the package was implemented rather effectively and swiftly, the Russian part was not implemented at all. And at the same time, on several occasions, while that part of the initiative was still functioning, the Ukrainian part, the Black Sea corridors that our naval officials opened up for the safe passage of ships carrying grains, those same channels were used, those corridors were used several times to launch UAVs over the maritime space in order to carry out strikes on Russian ships. And we warned we issued warnings several times, and those warnings were not heeded. But the main reason why we left the agreement is that everything that was promised to us turned out to be a lie. I respect the efforts of the Secretary General, and I respect the efforts of Rebecca Greenspan, the Secretary General of UNCTAD. They are genuinely making an effort here, but we have not seen our main agricultural bank return to the SWIFT system, nor have we seen a solution for to allow Russia's unimpeded access to ports in the Mediterranean and others, nor a solution to the issue of insurance, whose cost has risen fourfold. None of this was addressed. And by the way, the Ukrainian part of the package that was signed last year also contained a commitment to once again resume shipments of ammonium when it comes to responsibility for exporting fertilizer. You all know that even before we left initiative, this ammonium pipeline was blown up, and nobody is carrying out any investigations or even bothering to remember about this incident. But when it comes to the Nord Stream, this is yet another example. I am tired of listing them all. It is yet another example of important facts being swept under the rug and a preparation of another package of lies so that then they can build further geopolitical designs based on those lies. This is part of the same list as Bucha, Salisbury, Navalny. The Nord Stream is part of this, as well as the ammonium issue. And going back to the prospects of reviving the Green Deal, I was somewhat surprised. We're continuing to work, as I said, with the Secretary General, Rebecca Greenspan, but I was somewhat surprised when the Secretary General, in an interview to you on the eve of the General Assembly, said that he is still seeking to ensure the implementation of the memorandum between the UN and Russia to begin using the corridor for exporting Russian grain and fertilizer, but that this regime should not violate the sanctions regime that has been illegally levied against the Russian Federation by the U.S. and their Western allies. And this is telling. He understands that there's nothing he can do because in over a year he has been given to understand that there is no way sanctions will be lifted or even eased to implement a part of that package. So he is looking for artificial ways to go around those sanctions, and he recognizes that he has to work within those sanctions. And that's how, instead of the Russian main agricultural bank, we have some branch in Luxembourg getting that advantage. We're seeing also attempts with bank transfers to achieve one-off agreements with U.S. banks So what we were proposed is essentially that the Ukrainian part of the deal would be resumed immediately, whereas your part of the deal will be under discussion for another couple of months or so until something can be decided.
Two-part question. They're from
I'm sorry, excuse me, Reuters. The lady from Reuters, yes.
Thank
please.
you, Minister Lavrov. Michelle Nichols from Reuters. A follow-up to the Black Sea grain deal question. As you've mentioned, the Secretary General sent you a fairly detailed letter with 4 proposals that asking Russia if you would agree to those and commit to resume the Black Sea deal once those 4 proposals were put in place. Have you formally agreed with the Secretary General to move ahead with those, one of which was connecting a subsidiary of the Russian Agricultural Bank to SWIFT? And on Nagorno-Karabakh, will Russia send in more peacekeepers now? Thank you.
As for the letter of the Secretary General, I think I responded already. He himself characterized his proposals as focused on not receiving exemptions from sanctions, but rather somehow not violating these sanctions, but at the same time trying to find certain ways forward. The fact that you mentioned the example of the subsidiary of the Russian Agricultural Bank in Luxembourg, this is a subsidiary. He said, well, we'll reach agreement. So tomorrow we'll open the Ukrainian part of the deal, and in 2 months we'll link up that subsidiary. First of all, the subsidiary doesn't even have a banking license. And second of all, it has been idle there. It's in the process of being closed. Simply speaking, this just shows how in-depth UN experts' analysis is of these issues. Turning now to Karabakh. Our peacekeepers are currently helping to facilitate contacts there between the Karabakh representatives and the Azerbaijani officials. There were meetings held the day before yesterday. I believe there was more meetings today. Once again, our peacekeepers have a presence there on the basis of the importance of their role for confidence building, to ensure that the members of representatives of Karabakh, especially at the beginning, to feel themselves to be safe and secure. Time will be necessary. As for the amount of time and the number of peacekeepers, these are questions that are being resolved on the ground.
Is it accurate to say that Russia has formally rejected the Secretary General's proposal that was in that letter?
Well, if you definitely want to write some garbage and you something unpleasant, if you like the word rejected, then that's your choice, please. We explained to the Secretary General why his proposals won't work. We don't reject them. They are simply not realistic. They cannot be implemented in and of themselves. Next time, please write the truth.
Now, when it comes to the recent attacks on Crimea, there was a U.S. reconnaissance plane that was spotted in the area, and this points to the fact that the USA could have been directly involved providing data. In addition to that, we now have this promise from Biden to send long-range ATACMS missiles. So at what point does the United States become a partisan of this conflict? At what point does this actually become a direct conflict with the United States, not simply a proxy conflict via Ukraine? When do we define the United States as being involved?
There are legal norms pursuant to which a country is identified as being a direct party to hostilities, and we and Western countries are doing everything possible to avoid them, not to mention them. But the fact that they are effectively engaged in hostilities with us, using the Ukrainians as fodder, we see that those who are here present, those who have even the slightest interest in the huge flow of information that and analytical material that is emerging in connection with the Ukrainian situation, they know perfectly well that Americans and the British and many others are engaged in hostilities. They are waging war, first and foremost, through the deliveries of more and more volumes and quantities of weapons. Today, in the statement at the General Assembly, I mentioned the figures. about $170 billion at least being invested in Ukraine alone. Against the backdrop, and the statistics are also available to follow the promises, volumes, and timelines that the Western country provided to the Africans and other countries requiring assistance, first and foremost in terms of development and to address issues linked to climate change. One can compare this even slightly. There's no comparison. Consider the credits provided to developing countries with the IMF, the World Bank, and even the International Association for Development. Ukraine was provided with credits of approximately 700% of its quota. Nobody has ever done this, 700% of the quota. And Ukraine's debt is significant. And they have been allowed not to pay this until 2027. Such concessional and quick decisions are not taken were never ever taken with respect to any other country. But so on the weaponry, that's clear. Turning to instructors, that's also clear. There are training of instructors in Poland, in Germany, in the United Kingdom. I am certain that there are instructors working in large quantities on Ukrainian soil as well. And of course, there are many mercenaries there, many of whom are official officers, but the status, mercenary status, allows them to avoid a crossing of that legal threshold. But special information on satellites. We read about the statements about Elon Musk and his Starlink company's position, but military satellites are working throughout. Intelligence aircraft are also located and identified in the air, and U.S. reconnaissance planes, U.S. and British reconnaissance planes, are not only helping to identify objectives and targets, but they are showing where our air defenses are working so that next time they could help. So you can call this whatever you want to call this, but they are directly at war with us. We call this a hybrid war, but that doesn't change the reality.
Shah from Al Ghad Television. I have two parts question. The first part, I'm here, sir. The first part, you mentioned in your speech in front of the General Assembly that the world is about to witness a new multipolar system globally. Would that new system make the world a better, safer place, or would it lead to an arms race and a new Cold War? The second part is the United States always say that if the Ukrainians stop fighting, Ukraine will not exist anymore. Does the Russian Federation recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine?
Of course. Back in 1991, we recognized the sovereignty of Ukraine on the basis of the Declaration of Independence, which Ukraine adopted when it withdrew from the Soviet Union. And the declaration has a great deal of good written there, including that they will respect the rights of national minorities, that they will respect the rights of Russian language speakers, as well as Russian is explicitly spelled out there. Then this was reflected in the Ukrainian constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence, this was one of the main points for us was that Ukraine would be a non-bloc, non-aligned country, that it would not enter into any military alliances. And in that version, under those circumstances, we supported Ukrainians' territorial integrity when they had some kind of a mini coup back in 2004 when the Americans were dragged in unlawfully, forcing the Ukrainians to conduct a third round of elections, which were not stipulated in the constitution. They ultimately brought their person to the presidential post. And then, even then, we had good relations, working relations with them. But when the third coup occurred, this occurred... I understand that all these months I've been poorly explaining it, and even Wednesday I explained it poorly. It happened the day after the signing of an agreement on resolution. an agreement according to which early elections were to be held. Early in the morning, the opposition took up all of the administrative buildings, and when we began to call the guarantors of this agreement, France, Poland, and Germany, we were told not very clearly, but that democracy at times assumes these unusual contours. And the first objective for those Democrats who killed more than 100 people in carrying out the coup, the first thing they announced was that they would rescind the status of the Russian language in Ukraine. They immediately announced the crusade of armed fighters in the direction of Crimea to seize the Crimean parliament. These people simply began to protect their homes, to protect their language, to protect their traditions, and they conducted a referendum, quite simply. And Crimea immediately rejoined the Russian Federation. With respect to Donbass, as soon as the referenda were conducted, Kiev unleashed military aviation, tanks, they bombed residential areas and cities, and these atrocities ended 1 year later with the signing of the Minsk agreements. And last year, everybody other than Putin who signed on to those agreements, Merkel, Hollande, and Poroshenko, said we had no intention of implementing anything. We needed time to provide Ukraine with weaponry to use against Russia. And most importantly, we were often told, even by the Secretary General, that we need to implement the resolution on Ukraine because the General Assembly adopted that resolution. Very well, if we are to adopt that logic, implement it. But why aren't resolutions on many other issues being implemented, including on decolonization of the Mayotte Island, the Chagos Archipelago? Why is the UK skirting implementation of the General Assembly resolution on the Malvinas? If we were to take those resolutions, we know about the methods of exerting pressure, those methods that our Western colleagues harness. They all agreed. And approximately one-third, a good one-third, did not support those resolutions. And the resolution that I mentioned was unanimously adopted on the principles of relations between sovereign states on the basis of the Charter of the United Nations. And it describes sovereignty and territorial integrity. All are must comply with the territorial integrity of those countries whose governments respect the principle of self-determination of peoples, and in connection with this have governments, and in connection with this represent all of the peoples residing on this territory. So to be respected, you need to respect your population. And the United Nations Secretary General, our esteemed Antonio Guterres, in one of his statements, he mentioned the principle that opens the charter, we the peoples, means democracy, means that the governor, those governing need to have secure the consent of the governed. And the General Assembly also said there will be respect for the territorial integrity of those who represent the entire population residing on their territory. When, against Donbass and against Crimea, a war was unleashed, essentially, how can it be said that the governments of these putschists represent the people, either the people of those territories who last year conducted referenda on rejoining the Russian Federation? So we have no problems with territorial integrity of Ukraine. This was destroyed by those who carried out and supported the coup, whose leaders declared war against their own people, and who began to bomb their own people.
Nippon TV, please.
Thank you. My name is Shiho Matsuoka, and I'm with Japan's Nippon Television. On North Korea, how do you think their leader Kim Jong-un's visit to Russia will affect the relationship between Russia and North Korea? And what are you planning to discuss when you visit North Korea next month? And separately, were there any particular reasons why you did not listen to President Zelensky's speech both in GA and Security Council? Thank you very much.
The visit of Kim Jong-un to the Russian Federation included comments to the press by our president, and he talked about the areas of cooperation that were discussed and that we agreed to further develop. And in accordance with the agreements reached between Kim Jong-un and Mr. Putin, we will carry out my negotiations in Pyongyang, which may indeed take place next month. I haven't even thought about your other question. He wasn't at his best, by the way. I watched it on TV. He seemed rather grim. But I have my own affairs to attend to. We all know what he's going to say, so why waste time? I had 33 bilaterals planned, and they were much more useful, to be honest.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. This is, yeah.
Please.
Thank you.
And you will be next.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Maria. And thank you, Mr. Minister. This is Abdul Hamid Sayam from the Arabic daily Al-Quds Al-Arabi. I've been asking you a similar question every time we meet about Palestine. But this time I have two parts of my question. A few days ago, the ambassador of the U.S. stood here. She talked about the priority of the U.S. about upholding international law of the U.S. Yeah. She spoke about the priorities of the U.S. upholding the international law and the UN Charter. And the same press conference, she was asked about the Golan Heights, and she repeated that the country is still upholding that resolution of 2019, recognizing the Golan Heights as part of Israel. So I want you to comment on this double standard. And continuing double standard, every time I ask about the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves, similar to other people who fell under colonialism and foreign domination, then they start talking about two-state solution, and the SG spoke about the example of Gandhi. He wants the Palestinian to follow the example of Gandhi, who has 450 million behind him, not like the Palestinian whose backs are against the wall. Do the Palestinian people have the right to resist their occupation and foreign domination by Israel? Thank you very much.
On the Palestinian issue, we have resolutions from both the Security Council and the General Assembly of the UN, and we stand for everyone to be guided by these resolutions. When it comes to your first question, I will read out this text and we'll continue after.
The Donbas is very important to Russia's security. As long as Zelenskyy is in power in Ukraine, as long as NATO is present in Ukraine, militia groups backed by NATO, the Zelenskyy regime itself, all of this pose a significant security threat to Russia, and as a practical matter, the control of the Donbas in that situation, I think, remains of real importance to Russia's security. Legal questions are something else. And over time, if the situation were to change in Ukraine, that's something we'd look at. But we are nowhere near as that. А я сейчас зачитаю оригинал.
And now I will read the original. That was Anthony Blinken, an interview to Wolf Blitzer, 8 of February 2022. He was asked about the Golan Heights.
The legalities of that question. He started with leaving aside the legalities. As a practical matter, the Golan is very important to Israel's security as long as Assad is in power in Ukraine, in Syria. As long as Iran is present in Syria, militia groups backed by Iran, the Assad regime itself, all of this pose a significant security threat to Israel. And as a practical matter, the control of the Golan in that situation, I think, remains of real importance to Israel's security. Legal questions are something else. Вот вам ответ, пожалуйста.
And that's the answer to your question.
Thank you so much, Maria. Thank you so much, Minister. A very quick question on Iraq. Yesterday you met with the Iraqi...
Yeah, my name is Diyar Kurda. I'm working for Rudaw TV, the largest media outlet in Kurdistan region of Iraq. Yesterday you met with the Iraqi foreign minister, and you know the Russian companies are still operating in Iraq and in Kurdistan region of Iraq. But the Iraqi government could not pay their debts and also duties because of the U.S. sanctions. How are you going to resolve this issue with the Iraqi government while the U.S. is rejecting to waive Iraq from these sanctions? And the second question, you have a good relation with the Kurdistan region of Iraq and also Iraqi government. Now the Iraqi government and the Kurdistan region have disputes over budget issue and also over oil revenue shares. Do you have any engagement or encouragement with both governments to overcome their disputes? Thank you.
This is between the Iraqi government and whom?
Kurdistan government.
Okay.
They have disputes. Do you have any engagement with them? And if President Donald Trump says that if I'm coming back to the White House, I could resolve the Ukrainian war very quickly. Do you think if he's going to come back to the White House, you could resolve the Ukrainian war very quickly?
Ну, это вы спрашиваете у...
Well, you should be asking that of Donald Trump or those who will be helping him do that. The first question was, what if Zelenskyy were to do away with his decree? Well, we don't engage in these fantasies and inventing hypothetical situations in which we will have to work. We work with real situations that are unfolding. We have a Nazi regime in Kiev that has prohibited negotiations with us. And before it did that, by the way, we did have talks in March and April 2022, and we agreed on things. But then 2 days later, Bucha happened, because I think someone in London or Washington didn't want the war to end. You should read what McConnell said not so long ago, the senator, about support for Ukraine not being charity, but rather being an investment into the U.S. military-industrial sector. And it is something that encourages the entire West to invest in producing weapons in the United States, and thus it helps increase U.S. influence on Europe. They were very open about this. So as far as anything that can be done by anyone, I don't know. But once again, I stress that we were prepared. And what's more, we agreed to negotiations. We came to an agreement in April 2022. And after that, from what I understand, Zelenskyy was told that if they came to an agreement so quickly, let's keep on exhausting them. And so then they said only on the battlefield. So when we're being asked about negotiations now, Putin has commented very clear that we are prepared for negotiations, but we will not consider any ceasefires proposals because we already did that once and you deceived us. And the other question.
Companies are still operating in Iraq.
Yes. They are operating and they continue to operate. And the process is underway of finding solutions that will make Russian-Iraqi relations independent from whoever it may be in Washington or any other capital where people who believe themselves to be the masters of the world have come to power.
Мы приветствуем диалог.
We welcome dialogue between the government of Iraq and Kurdistan. When I was in Iraq last time, I traveled to Erbil as well, and it seemed that the overall sentiment in Baghdad, in Erbil, was focused on addressing problems. As for specific agreements, the representatives of those groups, the government and Kurdistan, need to find compromises.
South Africa Broadcasting.
South African Broadcasting, Mr. Minister. Since we've been talking a lot about Antonio Guterres in this conversation, let me quote what he said in the Security Council on Wednesday. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in clear violation of the United Nations Charter and international law, is aggravating geopolitical tensions and divisions, threatening regional stability, increasing a nuclear threat, and creating deep fissures in our increasingly multipolar world. You'll be aware, Minister, that the big focus at this UN General Assembly has been the Sustainable Development Goals and the lack of implementation. Only 15% of the targets have been met. Is this war not a continued distraction from the bigger and broader development agenda of this organization?
Of course, it's a distraction, only it's not the war that's a distraction, but the West is doing everything to distract attention from the problems that it itself has been creating for many years in the global economy, including on the food and energy markets. When even pre-COVID, well, I won't go into details. This is all something that has been said on many occasions. So, of course, they want to reduce all problems of global development to this ongoing war. And it's not even that they've introduced sanctions that prevent our food and energy to be supplied as broadly as possible around the world. They're claiming that it's not because that they prohibit any group of countries from doing their own thing. Instead, they insist that those countries denounce Russia. There was a Latin America EU summit that had nothing to do with Russia. When we had a Russia-African summit, we did not denounce anyone in our final declaration, whereas these champions of democracy, I think, just completely exhausted everyone with their incessant demands for the outcome documents to denounce Russia. That's the problem. It is the West that is trying to blame Russia and Russia's actions in Ukraine for all the world's problems, and they're not successful in this. We had a G20 summit in India just now, and I think that the text of that summit was objective, not only when it comes to Ukraine, which is only mentioned once, but it was objective about the geopolitical situation as a whole, that all conflicts need to be considered, not just those that one has a specific interest in. We just talked about Palestine, and we all know that the U.S. is doing everything possible to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. But somehow this doesn't seem to cause great concern, except for our colleague who just asked that question. When it comes to the real situation, well, there were outcries about this Black Sea initiative and that everyone would die now. First of all, the part of the initiative that was being implemented, the Ukrainian part, well, only 3% of the grain that went to markets actually went to poor countries that are on the World Food Programme's list. They're all in Africa. 40%, 48% of the grain ended up in the EU, and the rest also ended up in countries with above average incomes who have the funds to purchase their food themselves. So those 3% that over the time that the Ukrainian part of the deal functioning that ended up in Africa, we have already compensated those. We will take those same volumes and even increase those. But I'm saying this about the outcries of the crisis, about hunger as a weapon. Has anybody looked at the statistics for world food markets? The prices, after rising slightly, are now at the same level they were in 2021. Take a look at the figures, and when you report on this, please try to take those into account. Don't forget that Ukrainian grain is being offered to EU member states in excess, whereas some of those states don't want to buy that grain because they have their own farmers who don't want competition that can bankrupt them. If the European Commission is spending tens of billions of dollars on Ukraine, and it has just pledged 50 billion over 3 years, why does this grain that Ukraine wants to sell and that the EU countries don't want to buy because of the competition, why doesn't the Commission buy this grain and send it to Africa? Why do the northern ports of the EU and the Baltics and in Amsterdam have 260,000 tons of fertilizers languishing there when Africa needs those fertilizers. We said back then that by seizing that fertilizer, you're violating all norms of international trade, but we are transmitting those fertilizers free of charge to African states. It took 6 months for the first shipment of 20,000 tons to get to Malawi, and further number of months for fertilizers to reach Kenya. We are now trying to send 34,000 tons to Nigeria, but all of this is stuck, and no one is doing anything, and no one is asking EU member states at press conferences about why they are holding fertilizers hostage and leaving it to rot when countries need this fertilizer. Look at the numbers. Look at the statistics about what's happening on the food markets, the energy markets. Everything becomes clear when you do that.
Our ally in BRICS, Saudi Arabia, announced that they could gain nuclear weapons in response to the Iranian threat. What is your view of this statement? I heard what was said. If Iran were to come into possession of nuclear weapons, then we in Saudi Arabia would also have to consider this. And this is something which I view as a statement of fact. Nobody wants to see the emergence of new nuclear states. And the Islamic Republic of Iran has repeatedly confirmed that they have no such intention. Even their faithful leader has issued a relevant fatwa. So we believe that since they won't have the bomb, then Iran's neighbors won't be tempted to take that path.
Afghanistan, please.
Thank you so much, Maria. Mr. Lavrov, next week, Russia is hosting a Moscow format. What is your expectation from that format? And also, is Russia, like China, is planning to send an ambassador to Kabul? And also another question. A couple days ago, Antony Blinken at the Security Council said Iranian drones are being used by Russia to attack civilians in Ukraine, which is violating the resolutions 2231. What is your response to that? And also considering the new deal between Iran and U.S., are you hopeful that the JCPOA talks are going to be starting again soon? Thank you.
This is a question not for me on the Iranian deal. I hope that you will have the opportunity to ask the British and the French and the Germans, who have already announced that on the 18th of October, there will be the expiration of the requirements of Security Council Resolution 2231, expiration of the requirements related to the missile programs of Iran, which have nothing to do with the nuclear program, and which were included in the resolution simply to strike a compromise, and the Iranians agreed. But all of the restrictions on the missile issues expire on the 18th of October. And now London, Paris, and Berlin have announced that in our national capacity, we will comply with these restrictions. Is this not giving rise to any concern with respect to how Iran responds to such issues, how it should respond to such issues? On the one hand, a little bit over a year ago, an agreement was reached on the text for the resumption of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has been idle. And this is because the Europeans are not too keen. And on the other hand, this turnaround about the refusal to implement the Security Council resolution as regards the end of sanctions on the missiles, and on the third level, we need to be pragmatic. If they don't wish to sincerely, in an honest way, renew what was approved and what worked, simply that the U.S. administration took and closed down, if they once again wish to deceive everybody, if they wish to make up something in addition, that is not honest. There was a resolution. It was canceled by the West. None of the Europeans were protesting against this, and then they began to return and do things under in an underhanded way. So also, let's not forget that there will be elections soon in the United States, and as for the next administration's approach to the JCPOA, that's something we don't know about. Turning to the Moscow format, it will be convened in Kazan, not in Moscow. We are looking forward to a discussion about how neighboring countries can help Afghanistan when it comes to surmounting its current difficulties. I didn't understand your question about when we will send an envoy to Kabul or an ambassador. He never left. He was working there, and our embassy continues to work there. And turning to drones now, we have listed today, we've had so many statements listed about various officials, national and international officials, which are completely unsubstantiated, or at least the facts have not been advanced by anybody. We were asked about the drones. Just show us one drone, at least once, to demonstrate that this is our drone. So as a result, I can't comment on these kinds of statements. Mr. Blinken, at length, with enthusiasm, and with great zeal, announces lots of things. And he announced the end of the post-Cold War era. And now the G7 needs to lead to benefit not just its people, but also the people of the rest of the world, if the people in the rest of the world are to listen. So we can discuss that.
Please. No, just a second, please. Yeah, RT.
Russia Today на французском.
Russia Today in French. Oleg Kuroshenko is my name. Thank you very much for the opportunity to put a question to you. I'd like to ask you about our diplomatic efforts on the African track. You conducted a number of meetings with your African colleagues. On the whole, how did they go? And I would like to ask about what, in your view, is the source of the interest of more and more African countries, their interest to Russia, and how is our approach different from other major geopolitical players in the region? Thank you very much. Negotiations were held in a very constructive and a fruitful way. We, as our first order of business, considered tasks and objectives that need to be addressed for the implementation of the outcomes of the Russia summit, which was held in July in St. Petersburg. And naturally, every country with every country we have a bilateral agenda. And there were two main thrusts: trade, as such, on the one hand, and joint investment projects, infrastructure plans, educational projects, culture, and much else. And of course, medicine and healthcare was also discussed. And in many countries, there is an understanding that we are not looking to exploit natural resources to export them and to process them at home, but rather to establish a foundation for their own economy that will generate added value, thereby and raising their GDP. And Russia-Africa Summit, the president of Uganda spoke, and he shared interesting statistics of the world coffee market, which is assessed at, this is approximately $460 billion annually. That's the coffee market. And of this money, Africa receives, I'm afraid to misspeak, but certainly less than 10%, $40 billion approximately, because they sell the coffee beans to transnational corporations. They are roasted, they are processed by those corporations, they are ground, packed, delivered to consumers. And this is a very stark and telling example of how Africa continues to be used as a source of resources in a way that is similar to colonial times. All of our plans, on the other hand, are focused on the development of modern technologies. With many states, we have been engaged in discussions on the deployment of ground facilities for our satellite navigation GLONASS system. We're discussing this Rosatom facilities, including non-energy facilities such as nuclear medicine, the use of nuclear technologies in agriculture, And infrastructure projects are discussed, including the construction of railways. In a number of countries, laboratories have been built to identify and to combat communicable diseases. There's a lengthy list. Education, of course. There's a large number of Africans who are studying enjoying the funds from our budget. And this is impressive. I don't know how Western countries speak to them, but I would guess that it is somewhat arrogant. We never behave this way. We have a very human relationship with them. And I think this is something they appreciate.
The very last question, please. Yes. No, the lady, second row. Thank you. Louder, please, a little bit.
Thank you.
Does it work?
Thank you. Ejlal Turankulam, Anadolu Agency. Thanks so much. This is a follow-up question on the Black Sea grain deal. During the Security Council this week, the UN Secretary General Guterres said that some are questioning whether Russia has any real interest in rejoining the Black Sea Initiative. I was wondering if you have any response to that, and is Russia interested in rejoining the grain deal? And also, do you have any updates on the talks between Turkey, Russia, and the UN on the revival of this deal? Thank you.
On the arrival of what?
Revival of the grain deal.
As for the statements from Mr. Guterres, I can't respond as to his mood at any given point of the day. And speaking on the substance, I've already described all of this in detail. We were lied to, and the Secretary General was misled as if the West would do something right now. They directly said we would not ease sanctions to help facilitate the export of Russian fertilizer and grain. They said this directly, and he recently said, "I am not violating sanctions. I'm searching for ways to implement the sanctions." So it turns out that Secretary General would be implementing sanctions, but at the same time to find certain approaches to ensure that the West is merciful and as an exemption to do something somewhere there. This is not our issue. We set out in great detail to representatives of the United Nations today. My deputy has been working with Rebecca Greenspan and Mr. Griffiths. They will also continue on this matter. They are aware of all of this. We did not make up those proposals, which in the initial text were included by the UN Secretariat. They listed all of this. None of that was implemented. And in principle, let us once again recall what President Putin said. As soon as everything that is enshrined in the Russian part of the package is implemented, on that very day, the Ukrainian part of that initiative, the Secretary General, will become operational. Thank you.
Edith, we have to proceed our isolation and isolate ourselves from you for a while. Thank you very much.